Friends, we are meeting again to discuss the issues pertaining to philosophy and aesthetics for the postgraduate course in visual arts. Today, we are planning to discuss medieval life, medieval art and medieval aesthetics. The term medieval is a slightly ambiguous term. It is interpreted differently in different cultures. In the European context, the medieval period of world history is basically the time period from about 4th century till 14th century AD that covers the developments after the Greco-Roman period and before the Renaissance in Europe, namely the early Christian or Byzantine, Romanesque and Gothic. During this time, the world was emerging from the knowledge and the understanding of the world as presented by the Greeks and discovering new areas of morality, ethics and knowledge like religion and also science. The polytheistic Greco-Roman religion is replaced with the monotheist Christianity, and that followed the Son of the God. The notion of God and his supposed role in the universe was radically changing. The Greeks have by now done a very good job of clarifying the nature of phenomenon and the visual corporeal world. They have debated and discussed how human beings are able to perceive things, and scholars like Plato and Aristotle have further detailed finer aspects like what do we really see when we look at anything in nature or the man-made world. For example, a mountain or a tree or a flower in nature or a house or a table or a bed as man-made objects. They have discussed ideas and concepts like perception, that is how we see, touch or feel objects, and the world around us, and also discussed how we later remember things, and they brought out the fact that the sense of man are quite limited in their capabilities of creating our understanding of the world around us. Plato's famous allegory of the cave is a great example of showing how man can only perceive and understand what is immediately and directly presented to him in purely sensory terms, and that the senses can be deceptive and make us believe what may not be true in reality. Plato and his pupil Aristotle contributed immensely to the discipline of philosophy, and the influence of their theories is discernible on the scholastic discipline even today. While science was a very basic stage of development at this time, the three major religions of the Western world, namely Christianity, Judaism and later Islam, had by now become popular, and various parts of the world were adopting one or the other of these three religions to a greater or lesser degree. The medieval world that we talk about is primarily the area of the world that was under Roman domination by about 3rd century AD. What we call the Western civilized world basically includes a large portion of today's Europe, the United Kingdom and the United States of America as we know them today. This whole area, except the American continent, was ruled by the Romans. The Roman king Constantinople had also taken an important decision to convert to Christianity from the existing Roman pagan religion or worship the tradition. He saw a vision in which Christ appeared to him along with the symbol of the cross against the sun, and he took this as a sign to him from God, and he further declared that Christianity would become the official religion of the Roman Empire from here onwards. Consequently, after 3rd century AD, we see an explosion of this new religion all over the Roman Empire, mainly in the form of the building of churches and centers of worship to popularize this new religion. This newfound understanding of the world as being created by some perfect creator, whom we call the God, has contributed greatly to the development of the medieval worldview, which was centered upon the world as a mystical and perfect creation of God. So we can see that the early understanding of the world as being created by a god plays a very important role in the development of the medieval approach to understanding the phenomena that makes us the tangible and visible world around us. Plotinus, the Greek-speaking scholar in the Christian world, 3rd century Common Era, mentions in his writings that God is light. The beauty of a color is derived from a form that dominates the obscurity of matter and from the presence of an incorporeal light, that is reason and idea. This incorporeal light that he speaks of is equal with God's light, the light that gives splendor to the whole of creation. The light is important as it allows the beauty of object in the world to become illuminated or visible to the ordinary man. Also, the light allows the display of their beauty to the fullest. Here we can imagine a beach scene or the rolling hills and valleys of mountain ranges as we see them at night. The glory and magnificence of the Himalayan remains as it is, but due to the absence of light, it seems muted, almost non-existent. Come morning, and we can see their entire glory being revealed by the magical illumination of the sun's rays or light. Thus, it is light that is the means by which God reveals His amazing creations, that is the world, to the ordinary men. Plotinus actually goes much further in his definition of the spiritual cosmology of his personal universe. He says that there are three foundational aspects to this entire manifestation of creation that we call the universe. He names them as the one, the intelligence, and the soul. He states, phenomena are a poor mimicry of something higher and intelligible, which he calls the one. He uses these words to describe the one, and the one is the light. It is supremely transcendent, containing no divisions, multiplicity, or distinctions. It, that is the one, is beyond all categories of being and non-being. It cannot be any one existing thing, nor is it the sum total of all existing things. It is the good and the principle of beauty. It is a sheer potentiality or without which nothing could exist. The argument of the one and the soul propounded by Plotinus is actually very close to how the Advaita Vedanta defines or tries to understand the duality of man and the higher power of God. Radhakrishnan, in his translation of Bhagavad Gita, refers to the following. When defining the Brahman or the ultimate reality or power, we cannot use standard constructs to state what it comprises of or does not contain. Since the Brahman is all-pervasive and all-inclusive, it cannot be described with any attribute that can be ascribed to it. Brahman can perhaps be better understood by defining what it actually is not. This construct of neti neti or na iti is used to define and actualize the Brahman as being, neither this nor that. It is away, without a within or a without, neither dead or living, neither light nor darkness. Pseudo-Dionysius, another medieval scholar who goes back to 5th century CE, also stated as follows, and what of the sun's rays? Light comes from the good. Then the good is also praised by the name light. Here, we can see how the fact of light being essential to our experience of the universe now gets a value attached to it, that is of goodness. To sum up the symbolic aspect of light and its significance in medieval aesthetics, there is the hand of God in all creations, which are the beauty of the world around us. These are revealed and seen by ordinary humans through the means of the divine light. This divine work of art, that is, the world, reveals its beauty to us through light, and the universe reveals its creator, that is, the God, through its beauty to us mortal humans. Another scholar, St. Thomas Aquinas, who goes back to 1224 to 1274 AD, a priest and a theologian, is perhaps the most significant scholar whose theories crystallized the Christian aesthetics thought. He was a supporter of the four causes, that is the final cause, the formal cause, the material cause and the efficient, proposed by Aristotle, and pleaded that the supreme efficient cause of every creation is the God. His ontological, epistemological and axiological positions are obviously governed by the Christian sense of morals and ethics. He says that firstly, there is the necessity of actuality, which put simply is just that an object has to exist or to be, to even be beautiful. This is straightforward and quite clear. Secondly, he states that it is the different forms that separate the existence of different things. This is also quite evident by itself. A tree and a nearby mountain are both defined and separated from each other by their individual forms, as are all objects in nature and the entire world around us. The third condition he puts forward is that of action. He states, action completes the actualities of forms. Here we can consider a visual or a dancer in dance clothes, ready for a performance. In a visual, where we have the dancer simply sitting on a bench or anything else, we know it is a dancer. We can see the seated person and also see her clothes and make that connection. But we can never understand what the dancer does or what is this thing called dance through that static image of the dancer on a bench. Now, visualize another image, that a dancer in the middle of a dance performance. Here we can see the person, we can see her distinct attire or clothes that are necessary for the dance, and in addition, we see and feel the entire aspect of a dance performance through the dynamism in the visual, in the stance, the placement of the feet, the hand gestures, the facial expressions and the various elements of the costume as they react or interact to her movements, flying hair strands, garlands and other ornaments in apparent motion, a swirling skirt, a twisted torso, all become the dance for us in our mind. St. Thomas Aquinas also discusses another interesting concept. What exactly creates or is beauty comprised of in any form or subject? He says that though beauty is like a sort of divine order, it can be created. He says that beauty is a matter of size and order. He states something too small or too large cannot be perceived in the whole. For example, a mountain ridge cannot be understood or even comprehended if we stick our face close to the surface of a mountain. Our eyes can and will only see the immediate 4 to 10 inches that we can perceive. The glory of the huge and magnificent mountain and its companion mountains that make up the range will elude us. Order, he further defines as the relationship of the parts or those mathematical proportions between parts of a beautiful object can be worked out, and it is these relative proportions that make up order within any form. He identifies perfection, clarity and appropriate proportion as the three conditions whose existence is necessary for us to perceive beauty. But beauty being a sum of the whole or the parts cannot be extended beyond the man-made creations. He argues that if the ultimate beauty depends upon symmetry, then this implies that the object has more than one part or is a complex object. And so, by deduction, only complex things or forms can be beautiful. This is a misleading idea since there are many forms and objects in the world that are relatively simple and not composed of many or diverse parts in some complex relationship with each other in terms of proportion or size and etc. The second interesting thing that comes out of this statement is that only the whole object can be beautiful in such cases, since beauty is a result of symmetry between different parts and not the individual parts of any object or form. To further elucidate this reasoning, he argues if something is beautiful, then it must be composed of beautiful parts. Basic logic implies this condition. Aquinas has stated that if the parts of any object are symmetrical, they, by deduction, cannot be beautiful. This argument seems absurd if we take into consideration that sometimes a beautiful object may actually be composed of individually ugly parts or parts that are not necessarily proportionate or symmetrical and by inference beautiful. In conclusion, he helps us to understand that only symmetry cannot be a standard or a condition to measure an object's beauty. St. Aquinas, like his predecessors, pleads that the God is not composed of parts. He is not changeable and not in time, that is, he is timeless. All these persuasions of Plotinus, Pseudo-Dionysius and St. Thomas Aquina shape up the medieval comprehension of beauty. There are three main aspects to medieval aesthetic understanding, that is, proportion, light and symbolism. The first, proportion, is best understood more correctly as the insignificance of man before some God's grandest creations like mountains or oceans. When we face a glorious and mighty example of God's amazing creativity like the Himalayas, a man feels small and insignificant and becomes, at best, but a humble and feeble creature that is overpowered by the sheer grandness of God's creation. How it played out in medieval philosophy is that the early Christians built some of the grandest monuments to their God in the form of impressive and monumental cathedrals and basilicas in their attempt to bring out this aspect. God is the ultimate creator, and he is single-handedly responsible for the amazing diversity and complexity of the entire universe and our world within it. Nowhere in this more evident or clearly visible that in the towering glory of the spires and the turrets of the Notre Dame in Paris. Or in the grand majesty of the Cologne Cathedral with its overtly decorative arrays of turrets and spires that almost seem to be from some castle in a fairy tale land. This cathedral has a magical and monumental presence that defies the imagination of man and is his ability to create things in this world. It seems to suggest that there is a higher power at work here, the hand of God in a sense. One can see this divine hand or guidance overseeing the works of man quite literally in the mosaic in one of the earliest basilicas in the town of Ravenna in Italy, in the Basilica of San Apollinare in Classe. This obsession with the supposed insignificant scale of man in terms of the true power of creation that lies with God is played out significantly in the architecture of many churches and cathedrals that were built during this time. Churches that were initially built to represent the house of God or the place where the ordinary people can go to and meet with the new Christian God, soon came to represent in themselves a symbol of the power and glory of His almighty presence. From modest and humble buildings in the initial stages around 1st to 3rd century AD, we soon see the church becoming more and more ostentatious, and the churches started to reach higher and higher and became very complex in their architecture and visible external features, almost to the point of becoming some kind of a never seen before structure or the dwelling place of a non-mortal being. They towered high above the city and seemed to reach up into the heavens with their massive presence. These cathedrals are St. Stephen's Cathedral, Burgos Cathedral, Reims, Milan, Seville Cathedral, York Minster, Notre Dame de Paris, Cologne Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, and Chartres. Their towering spires and pinnacles seem to reach into the clouds, and the house of God became a proverbial magical and mystical space within which an ordinary human being can come closer to the mystery and grandeur of the Almighty. In front of these buildings, the visiting human beings seem insignificant and small, inconsequential elements in this divine creation of God. Another significant aspect of medieval aesthetic deals with their approach to light. Light has been a central theme in both the medieval understanding and the rationalization of the world and entire creation. The universe becomes possible due to the magnificent vision of the Almighty or God, and He clearly manifests His greatness through the various beautiful and amazing creations that make up this world of ours. Only God can create such amazing and dazzling beauty as we can see in a sunset or a beach or in a mountain range that is covered by snow and clouds with the golden rays of the morning sun peeping through it all. But this entire universe and its many mysteries and beauties are only visible to man when there is light. Thus, light becomes the divine means through which God chooses to display or allow man to access and see all the many beautiful creations that He has made. This is further played out in the entire approach to the experience of the divine or God, as happens in most churches, and especially the grand and the magnificent cathedrals built in medieval times. The visitor is brought face to face with towering and glorious structures that seem to reach into the heavens. The front facade usually carries a rose window above the main door. Once inside, the cathedral usually follows a cross-shaped plan with the main door located at the end of the long arm. Thus, a visitor enters into the church and steps into the long corridor that leads to the main altar, far away from the main door. The entire passageway, as it were, would be lined with pillars, and they would further support a very high ceiling that stretches away in front of the visitor. The only source of light would be with the rose window at the main door. On both sides, above the main aisle, along with the top story, as we can see in some of the French cathedrals. And finally, at the altar, which would be surrounded with rose windows and normally features a lot of light. Symbolically speaking, the visitor, as it were, enters from the darkness and the lack of true knowledge of the human world into the house of God, where he is led down a long passageway that leads onto the true source of all things in the universe, or God, whom he can see shining brightly at the location of the altar. Medieval art and architecture is rich with this kind of metaphorical, allegorical manifestations which make it mysterious and enigmatic.